What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Facade. I'm your host, Gavin J Gallagher, and on this podcast I explore the mental and emotional game often playing out in your mind and the mind of everyone else in the real estate or property investment market. The key to success in this game is to master your mindset and behavior, to take control of your thoughts, your emotions, and most importantly, your ego. So here we are in episode 19, and last week I was talking with Mr. Anthony Slumbers, and so this week I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, and insofar as I'm actually playing back an interview that I did with a chap that for his podcast, and it's all about property investment, so it should be right up your alley. But before we get into that, I thought I would give you a little bit of update as usual. First of all, I am still at home, so you might notice that the sound is a little bit different than usual, but I'm sitting here on my kitchen table doing a little bit of work, and the baby is asleep upstairs, and I have to say it has been quite difficult to do all of this while I'm at home, so quite looking forward to getting back to work. Burpee challenge is complete. 10,000 burpees done during the month of August. Thanks to everyone who donated to the charity that I was supporting doing that. And thanks also for the various notes of support and stuff on the birth of my baby son, Dominic. Sleep has been pretty poor for the last week or so, I can tell you. But one thing I would just recommend very strongly is I bought a thing called an Aura ring. And that is, it's a ring that you wear on your finger. And I got it on right now at the moment, but it's called an Aura ring, and that's O-U-R-A, but it has all these sensors on the ring, and it can actually tell you wear it while you're sleeping. I hate wearing a watch while I'm sleeping because it kind of, you put your hand under your head and it's like banging off your head and things like that, but a ring you just do not notice at all, so I can sleep perfectly well with this ring on, and it gives me amazing accuracy around the tracking of my sleep. It knows exactly when I go to sleep, when I fall asleep, when I wake up, all of this kind of stuff. But it also goes into much more detail, telling you the amount of REM sleep you got versus the amount of deep sleep and light sleep and all this. And it's fascinating. It gives you these kind of dashboards and stuff. So strongly recommend you go and check that out, guys. And you'll find that in the resources. I'm going to put a link in the resources page of my website. So if you go gavinjgallagher.com/resources, you will find links to that. Just getting into the usual update. Behind the Facade community, we're at 208 members. I have not been driving the membership much lately, and so we've only added 3 in the last week. So welcome to all those new people. Just want to tell you a little bit about this week's episode versus next week's episode. I have been working on a episode that I'm going to call the cognitive bias episode. And what I have been doing is I've been looking into this thing that exists in pretty much everybody, but it's very subconscious. And a lot of people are just completely blind to the fact that it's controlling their thoughts. And your cognitive biases, there are many, many different types of biases, but there are things called confirmation bias and continuity bias and sunk cost fallacy and restraint bias. All of these things I'm going to be going into next week, and they are super fascinating. And if you can understand how these things control your thought process in your mind, if you can just become aware of them, you can possibly identify when you are actually succumbing to them. And that's an important thing. In the case, for example, of confirmation bias, what a confirmation bias is, it's a tendency to look for data or information that supports your already held beliefs. So say if you're looking at buying a property in a certain area and you've figured out in your mind that you want to buy in this area, you just have a gut and feel that this is what you want to do for whatever reason, you will go off and you will look for information that will support that. But if you find something that does not support your choice, you may overlook that, or you might just kind of basically discredit it. And you'll be building up this profile of all of these great, reviews of this area or these evaluations that are very supportive of what you want to do. And it is something that happens a lot. You've made up your mind, you want to buy this thing, and therefore you are going to go and force yourself to find information that supports that choice, as opposed to having an open mind and being sort of open to whatever the information comes. So if you have if you find something that's very negative and you start finding a lot of stuff that's negative, that you actually change your mind and you actually listen to the information. Anyway, that is going to be next week's episode. This episode that I'm about to play for you is from a guy called Michael Houghton, who is a podcaster, and he has a podcast here in Ireland called the Irish Fire Podcast, and he's all about financial independence, and he's a lovely guy. He lives here in Ireland, but he's actually, I believe he's Australian. I could be wrong there, so apologies if I got that one wrong, but I have to apologize to anybody who is already a listener of Michael's podcast and who has perhaps already heard this episode, but I'm playing it back because I cover quite a lot of property investment decision making and some of my backstory and things like that, so I figured it was a good episode to put on, and it also just gives me a little bit of time in this current situation working from home. I'm just finding it very hard to find the time to put together the work that I need to finish this cognitive bias podcast. So I'm going to be in the office this week, and I'm going to go and make sure I record that full episode while I'm there and not have the distractions and stuff that are going on here. So without any further ado, guys, I'm going to play you the interview that Michael Houghton of Irish Fire Podcast had with me a couple of weeks back. Hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the Irish Fire Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Houghton. I'm an entrepreneur, investor, and financial independence enthusiast, sharing my financial freedom journey. Stay tuned and welcome aboard. So Gavin, I am delighted to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on today. I guess if you wouldn't mind just starting by, giving a little bit of your background and how did you get involved and what are you doing these days?
Yeah, I started out as an architect. I qualified in 1997, but I had gotten involved in property before that because my father died when I was in college, and I was kind of forced to get involved in the family business. So I started at a kind of young age of 21 and got involved partly in a family business, and then I started kind of basically set up my own architectural practice and started practicing. And there was a kind of a watershed moment when I was working on a project for a client as my own boss, basically running a small architectural business. And I think I spent about 9 months working on this project, burning the midnight oil, doing all this kind of work. And at the same time, I was doing a very small little investment in a site in Enniscrone in Sligo. And I bought the site for, I think I paid £40,000, the old Irish pounds for it. And so it wasn't a huge amount of money. It was an amount that you could kind of accumulate over a space of time. And when I went for planning permission, and I got planning for 4 houses on it. And then when I started speaking to builders, the builders actually turned around and just said, we'd like to buy the site off you and we'll pay you $125,000. And I can just remember this moment when I went, what? Because the job that I was doing as an architect was paying me something like £8,000. And suddenly here in the space of a couple of months, this property transaction I was doing was bringing in, almost 100,000. And I can remember just suddenly realizing that, wow, this property business is something else. And so I kind of turned my attention pretty much full on into property investment and development at that stage. So I kind of got into it young because of that kind of experience. And I would say it served me well for a number of years, but then I made a couple of mistakes in the recession and that cost me quite a lot. So I've kind of, I suppose I have a bit of a roller coaster to report in terms of my background and my career.
And I know that these days, I believe that you're with East Point in Dublin. So
yeah, the family business was a commercial sort of property company, and my dad, when he died, was the chairman, but his brother stepped into the role then afterwards. And I didn't really have a role other than just making sure that the family's investment was looked after, and which is why I went off and I started my own business. But then what happened actually about 6 years into that is my uncle actually took his own life. And it was a complete shocker. None of us kind of saw any signs of depression or anything like that. But suddenly, over the space of a few hours, I was thrown into the deep end and had to become a director of, full director of the company. And then a month later, the CEO that was basically running all of the projects and stuff, he died of cancer. And he'd been fighting it for quite a while, but nobody expected the suicide of the chairman and then the death of the CEO in the space of about 30 days. And so myself and my two cousins, we basically joined forces and decided, like, we all had individual businesses and roles doing stuff elsewhere. And suddenly the three of us came together to kind of basically steady the ship. And so we were in the middle of a project called East Point. And at the time, it was a very risky project because it was a large landfill site that was bought from the local authority. In fact, it was partly bought from Dublin Port and then partly bought from Dublin City Council. It was, and basically it was an old tip that it had been a dump or a landfill site for like 25 years, and it had reached its fill and it had taken over, a certain amount of the Talca estuary. And we basically bought the land and had to kind of remediate it and then do a lot of stuff. But we decided to turn it into a business park. It would take a whole podcast to kind of explain that. But basically now today, 25 years later, I am the guy that's running the day-to-day operations here in the business park. And it's grown to quite a large business park now with different investors involved and stuff. And we have 37 buildings. We have about 50 different corporate occupiers, including some large ones like Oracle and Google. And we have on a kind of, before COVID-19, I should say, we would have had between 8,000 and 9,000 people a day coming into the park.
It's quite an amazing story about something that kind of, I guess, started from almost nothing in terms of it being landfill to have the vision to put that together. So, fair play, well done in that regard. Yeah,
it's a team effort. Obviously, it was the original CEO and my father was chairman. They had sort of gone ahead and bought the land and started kind of the initial plans, and they employed Scott Talon Walker Architects to do the master plan. But there was a couple of years when we were scratching our heads wondering, like, what would we even build here? Because landfill kind of basically means straight away that you're not going to be building residential because there's all sorts of health and safety considerations. And then we started thinking, Dublin Port is one big sort of warehouse, kind of lots of sheds and lots of big oil storage tanks and stuff. And we thought, I suppose we could just build another load of sheds and stuff and make it kind of light industrial. And then after that, we actually looked at a project in the UK called Stockley Park, which just opened, and it was very similar, and it kind of inspired us to do something very similar. So it's basically highly landscaped, and there's over 1,700 trees in East Point, and like ponds and lakes and all sorts of stuff. So it's a beautiful place, and we're very proud of it, and we're still involved in the day-to-day running 25 years later because we just want to keep this place, in the way it was meant to be. I've seen other business parks around Ireland that they didn't receive the care and attention, and they get a bit tired, and you start to see people losing interest in being located there. So we want to keep the place as best as we can.
And look, I think one of the nice things that you've done, Gavin, is, and I know from watching some of your YouTube videos, is some of the best advice that I think you've given is you need to treat property like a business. A lot of people go into property thinking, it's going to be a nice passive investment, or I don't want to be too involved. And I do know people who are landlords who, frankly, that don't seem to give two hoots about their investment property. Is that the first thing that you would say to people is, look, this isn't going to be passive, or is there something even before then that they should be thinking about?
I talk about I call them the 6 O's, and it starts with roadmap, and it's basically having an idea of what you want to do with your career and with your life and stuff, and that would kind of dictate then the type of investor you're going to be. Because, as in my case, I was an architect, so I had some skills in the kind of construction and design area. But there might be people that have absolutely no experience whatsoever in property or in any kind of aspect of construction. And those guys just might be out of their depth. So perhaps passive investment is the best way to go about it. But I think if you have skills of a certain type that are maybe useful as a more active investor, And if you're a person who has maybe a network of friends and contacts, that could be useful. So in my case, I knew lots of architects, I knew lots of builders, I knew lots of different people from the professional side of the business. So for me, it wasn't difficult to get advice on deals, and it wasn't difficult to make decisions because I did have people to kind of ask advice from. And that, I think, is part and parcel of it. I think if you go into it blind, property you can lose your shirt in this business. And I've had, very, very painful experiences where I kind of let my guard down and I didn't really pay much attention to a certain deal, and it cost me very, very dearly. And nowadays I say, treat it like a business, because what some people do is they buy something and it goes very well, not necessarily because of something they did, but say the market just rises and it happens to lift all boats. And those people suddenly think, wow, I've made all this money, and suddenly the lifestyle starts to kind of catch up. And I went down, I made that exact same mistake. And I was very fortunate in, I bought a couple of properties very, very well. And I guess you would call it lucky, more so than just me being some sort of genius. And I went into the deals with the intention of turning them into something. But then, a couple of months into it, a guy came out of nowhere and just wanted to buy the property and was prepared to pay me more than double what I had paid for it in only a couple of months. So, those kind of experiences for an untrained mind can suddenly make you kind of do silly things like go off and buy a fancy car and all this kind of stuff. And I made all those mistakes. So I'm trying to, one of the reasons I set up my own podcast was to try to kind of guide people in that way and make sure that people realize that if you let your guard down, if you don't concentrate, if you can end up in a situation where you really do lose a lot of money and people have gone bankrupt. And the worst thing is not so much the financial side, but it's the stress and strain that it puts on, a marriage. My own marriage collapsed during the recession of 2008, just from the pure strain of having multiple banks chasing me for millions. And so, it's a difficult thing. I wouldn't rush into it with your eyes closed. I would take this kind of as a serious kind of undertaking and not think that you don't need to do much work.
I think one of the things you mentioned there is and I've written in my notes here, be the deal maker. And I think that's quite powerful. And even taking my own case, I have zero DIY skills, Gavin. Absolutely none. I can't even get a TV up on the wall. But I do know a great builder who put our extension on. I do know great handymen. So as well as that kind of putting a deal together, I've got a great mortgage broker and good relationships with some of the bankers and so on. So that certainly helps as well.
The one thing to remember is this is a team business. It's not all about you. You might be the guy that obviously kind of comes up with the idea and you might originate the deal. The whole business it can be very complicated, especially if you go into the development side. Now, I'll leave the development side out, but there are so many things that can go wrong with a deal that you really do need to be quite on your guard, and you need to speak to a lot of different guys to make sure you're not making a mistake. And so things like architects are great to kind of bring on board to kind of get a steer as to, can I improve the house the way you might imagine? So you might be able to build an extension, you might be able to, reconfigure it slightly, and it might just make the place an awful lot more valuable. And then there's other things like knowing whether you have, the zoning is supportive to allow you to sort of build, say, a second house in the garden or things like that. I mean, some property deals that I've done in the past, and I'm not talking big, huge commercial deals like that I'm involved in today. I'm talking about when I started out, some of the small, simple deals actually did very, very well. And it was just about being kind of conscientious about what you're doing and bringing the right kind of team on board to kind of advise you and make sure you're not making any mistakes.
I mean, I guess, in the financial independence world, we're often told, and a sort of rich dad, Robert Kiyosaki, will always say, you need to be buying property for cash flow. They talk about making sure that the rent covers the costs and ideally a little bit more. Now, where I'm from in New Zealand, that would never happen, right? Because house prices are so overinflated and the rental market is so much lower that you would virtually never be in a situation. You'd almost be down money each month. Thankfully, in Ireland, it is possible to actually find investments that actually produce positive cash flow. Is that something that you've looked for in your experience, or are you more about actually trying to make a gain through redeveloping the property, maybe flipping it?
Yeah. I mean, that's where we're talking about the passive versus active business. And when you're an active trader, when you're an active person, then you can decide whether or not you're an investor or a trader. But passive is where you basically buy a property and you're hoping for that little bit of cash flow benefit, and that's it. There's no other. You're not talking about rolling up your sleeves and redesigning. You're buying it, and it sort of stands to make you a certain amount every month, and that's a respectable thing to do, and a lot of people go ahead and do that. But the stuff that I'm more interested in is, rolling up my sleeves, taking a sort of fresh look at the property and say, right, if I replace that kitchen and if I extend that rear room and if I build that extra bedroom, what will the property be worth? And that is there's a lot more involved in that. And I guess there's a greater degree of risk, but you can actually add, 20, 30, 40% to the value of the property. So what that allows you to do then is you can either rent it or you can sell it. Obviously, if you sell it, you take cash out and you got to pay some tax on it. If it's your own personal private residence, then you can avoid that tax bit. So I know a lot of people that did that, and they spent a lot of time kind of just moving from house to house to house and kept on renovating. And so they never paid any tax, which you've obviously got to speak to your accountant and see what's a respectable number of times to do that before people start questioning it. But there's, when you're getting into the business of, it's, a lot of people just go by the name B or, the Burr method. And it's, to buy it, to refurbish, and then to redecorate, and then to rent, and then to refinance. And that means that you can take out a chunk of equity. You've added, say, 30% to the value of the property. Now you can take back your original equity that you put in, so your deposit or whatever, you can release that back to yourself, and you can go out and you can do it a second time. So now you have one rental property, but you've created the income or the capital gain to go and start again. And if you do that in a sensible way, you can actually end up with multiple properties over a couple of years that are all paying you rent and slowly but surely, growing in value. I would say that they're kind of washing their face in terms of cash flow. You always need to be careful that, ignoring the fact that interest rates might rise at some stage in the future. And so that was something that actually caught me out, is that I basically had the property at a stage where it was exactly washing its face, but we were in a very low interest rate period. And then it started to creep up, and it got to the point where I was having to kind of put money in every month, and it started to get painful. And I sort of resolved after that never to kind of leave it so tight that was a risk. I think it's a good strategy to have, and you just have to be careful that you don't use the profits from the equity release into your hand. You don't misuse those, because a lot of people think, okay, I've got 50 grand sitting here. What am I going to do with it? And you let one of the things I talk about as your downfall in the property business will be brought about by one of 3 E's: your ego, your emotions, or the economy. And your ego is the one thing that really damaged me, was just my ego. And I would see friends of mine driving a certain type of car, and I'd be thinking, wow, I can afford that, and I'd go off and I'd take an equity release and I'd buy myself that fancy car. And that kind of thing is a slippery slope, because you don't realize, but you're basically, you're taking payment that is really not due for a couple of years, and you're pulling it forward. So I call that, premature reward, or it's basically not having the patience and discipline to wait it out, but you want the payment right now. You want the gratification right now. And so premature gratification is a big risk in this business, because if you've managed to do that nice big equity release, sometimes people sort of say, okay, now I can go and splurge on myself, rather than reinvest it and put it back in and recycle the capital.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that the way you probably need to be looking at this is reuse that capital to buy more property and try and live off the cash flow, I guess, that you ultimately generate from either the rental return or maybe that windfall if you do sell a property then, and make sure that you're constantly reinvesting that capital by the sounds of it. So yeah, I guess I wouldn't mind exploring a little bit more about how you kind of go about some of these deals, because I do get quite a lot of questions from people, and I know that on some of the financial channels that we do have, that we're often sharing potential development projects. And truth be told, most of us don't really have the expertise to even know what a good deal is or not. And I know that through various websites like BidX1, for example, You might often see what looks like a really, really good deal, but often you don't know sort of what's behind the scenes. And I guess sometimes it can be hard in Ireland as well, because the house might be 100 years old, or the property might be 100 years old, and you don't really know what you're going in for. I mean, is there any solid advice that you could give on somebody that's maybe seeing a potential development project on what they should be looking for, particularly if they don't necessarily have the expertise that like the likes of yourself has being an architect?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say is tread carefully. That the first, if you're going to do your first deal, you want to make sure it's a good experience and that you don't, misstep, and then that'll be it. You'll be out of the game, and you won't want to go back. And like most people who have a bad experience, that's the last time they do it. So it's a great business, and you can make a very good return, and you can add to your financial freedom and your independence very easily, if you just tread carefully. And if you know, like, the first thing to remember is that the market is cyclical. So there is going to be ups and downs, and a lot of people cannot avoid the moment where it turns down. You might be halfway through a construction project and suddenly the market has turned down, and you have to finish the project before you're going to be able to sell or do anything. So you always have to assume that there's a risk that the market could fall. So if you build a little bit of that into your business model, and you kind of say, okay, let's have a look at the three different outcomes. There's the very optimistic outcome that everything goes perfectly according to plan, and I end up making this nice bit of wedge. And then there's the other side where the builder gets it wrong, or we find dry rot in the house, or we do something wrong with, and the timing goes out, or the market changes. And you have to be very wary of the fact that things can go wrong in any kind of construction project, or you buy an old house. I mean, first thing is, as I mentioned, the team is important. If you can assemble a couple of guys around you, that sometimes the best way to do it is actually to do it as a team, is to kind of have partners and go in and buy things together. So if you've got weaknesses, I mean, if you're a person that doesn't have the first clue about anything to do with construction and stuff like that, but you're good at the financial side and you understand how, banks work and all that, well, then maybe the thing to do is to team up with a builder or somebody who can fill in and be complementary to the other side. Now, obviously you can do it all by yourself as well, but then you need to find that builder who's going to guide you. Buying an old house can be difficult. I mean, 100 years old, yes, you're certainly going to start getting into trouble. I've bought an old period house, and I had a house on the Grand Canal, and it was a beautiful old house, like built in the 1840s or something like that. And I wanted to turn it into kind of a residential property, so somebody could live right in the center of town. And I thought it would be a fantastic property as a rental property for, sort of somebody working for Google or something like that. And I bought it, and then I realized, sort of when I was into the project, that you can't even paint the walls of the property without planning permission, because it's a protected structure under the heritage rules. And when you get into that, you suddenly realize, God, this. And I had to go and get an archaeologist involved who had to do a big report, and that costs a couple of $1,000, and it took months of extra time. And then there's all these rules around health and safety. And so you do need to tread carefully. And I would say, don't be overly ambitious in your first deal. Go for something a little bit easier. A lot of people try to complicate things and try to do something that's particularly difficult for their first deal. And there's so many moving parts that you just have to, I would sort of caution people to kind of go for something a little bit easier, just to kind of wet your teeth. Get yourself into the market with a deal, learn how it works. I would suggest that people stay local to where they're from, so that they have some of the local knowledge and stuff. That if, I went and I've bought property abroad in New York and Spain and all these places, and there's a whole learning curve that it's like starting again when you go abroad. Whereas if you buy in an area that you've grown up in, or near to where you've grown up in, you kind of know a lot of the story and the history, and you also have a good chance of knowing people that live nearby, so you can have some sort of inside knowledge, and that's very helpful. Your team is important. Obviously, having a solicitor, he needs to do certain checks to make sure that the property hasn't got any problems with it. You need your architect to examine the property to see if there's any issues with planning historically. You need to probably get somebody to survey the house to see if there's any kind of risk of the electrical. I mean, if you buy a property that has electrical problems, you're going to have to do all of that. If you buy a house that has problems with the plumbing system, you're going to have to do all of that. So, you can't really start a deal until you have some idea what's involved. And a lot of the time people go in and say, okay, this looks fine, I'll repaint it and that's it. But then you find as soon as you start painting, you realize that the place has got damp and there's this and that. And a lot of architects and professional surveyors, they've got equipment that they stick a pin in the wall and it'll immediately tell you if there's damp problems and things like that. So I just think that it's probably worth your while being cautious about your first deal. And one of the things that I say in my own podcast is that first deal is actually probably the best deal that you'll do, because you'll get such a tight learning curve. You'll really learn a huge amount of the process, and you'll be super cautious because you don't want to lose money. And you'll probably do more due diligence in that one deal than you'll do in the next one and the subsequent ones. And I think people should stay hungry and stay kind of cautious, because when I got to a certain stage, when I was making kind of lots of money on deals, I suddenly got very complacent, and I would look at a deal and say, yeah, and I would kind of go on gut instinct and things. And those were just stupid deals that ended up costing me money. And so don't go on gut instinct. Do your research, figure out, are the adjoining properties, good quality, or are they going, is there problems with those? You need to know comparable evidence. What are the houses in that area going for? I get messages from people and they say, Gavin, I'm paying $135,000 for a house. Is that a good price? And they don't tell me the location. They don't tell me a lot of the different things. And I say, it actually doesn't matter what you're paying. What matters is, what did the guy next door pay? And is the house that he has similar in configuration? Does it have the same number of bedrooms? Does it have the same square foot area? Is it built in the same year? All of that will give you a guide. And if you can pick out a couple of properties that are similar in age, configuration, size, and all that on the same street, say, or in that same locality, then you have a good idea whether or not you're getting a good price. But just picking a price out of thin air just doesn't do it. You need to, and you also need to know what you're likely to be able to rent the property at. If you can sell it and you can make a nice profit, that's great. But what about your fallback? What if you're unable to sell because the market has changed? What are you going to rent it for? You need to have a whole load of questions that you can answer. And one of the reasons it's important to be able to answer all that is that if you decide to go to a bank and you want to borrow some money from the bank, they're going to ask you these very questions. And you want to be the guy that looks extremely organized, and you want to be the guy that sort of stands up and says, yeah, absolutely, here's the answers to all those questions. And the bank have confidence in you. They believe that, okay, this guy knows what he's doing, and they'll give you the loan. Whereas if you're there, I didn't realize you were going to ask me that question, let me go. The guys will start, questioning whether or not you're a safe bet, that if you didn't know that, maybe there's a whole lot of other stuff that you don't know. So I'd take caution in your first deal and just go to town and make sure you really know everything about that area and that property.
I guess speaking of the banks, that's one of the questions I had for you. And obviously we've been doing that ourselves recently when we managed to put our deal together ourselves from our end. But the banks are, frankly speaking, a nightmare. Is there any advice that you would give to people? I think it's fair to say that you need to kind of lead the banks a little bit and make sure that your numbers are good, and you follow their rules and learn their rules. It's, I guess, something that we did. Unfortunately, I'm self-employed, so we don't fit the normal bucket, so to speak, and that becomes very, very, very difficult. And thankfully, we found a very good mortgage broker that was able to make it work for us. But is there any sort of solid advice you'd give to, I guess the average investor just trying to get going when it comes to trying to get your finances in order to make this happen?
The best thing is to start the process with a couple of dry runs. And by that, I mean just get to know what the bank's requirements are. If you found the perfect property and you want to go and buy it right away, and you've got, so many weeks until it's going to be sold, and then you're only starting the conversation with the bank at that point, you're already way behind. You've got guys that have a good relationship with their bank manager, and the bank manager is confident in them, and for them it's just a phone call. I mean, some of the best deals that I did in my career, I basically picked up the phone and said, look, I need to borrow $1 million tomorrow. Is that okay? And they just say, okay, fine, you've got it. And that was because I had spent several years doing projects with them. I had paid off loans that I had borrowed. And so you get to that point where they have real confidence in you. And they, obviously it was a different time as well. They were throwing the money out the door, shoveling it out the door like there was no tomorrow. But it was based on confidence in your reputation for doing what you said. And if you're going to the bank for the very first time, you can expect a lot of pushback, a lot of questions, a lot of answering, documentation, and it could just take weeks for that to take place. So I wouldn't wait until you found the deal, until you do that. I would start investigating that now. Go in, meet your bank, talk to them about the rules and regulations. What would you expect? How much could I be expected to borrow? What is the size of the deposit I'll be expected? And what is the kind of information that you're going to be looking for? And if you can meet that same guy again and again and again, it'll get to the point where you build up a bit of a rapport with him, and the guy sees that you've grown, you understand an awful lot more now, and yes, I think you're ready, to borrow the money. And then you bring him a great deal that ticks all the boxes, and then you shouldn't have as much difficulty then. But certainly COVID-19 now is going to add an element of difficulty to it, because everyone's just that little bit more nervous now at the moment.
No, that's great advice, and I guess one of the experiences that we had was that they seem to like to see this kind of regular savings just almost put into a bank account or a savings account the same day each month, the same amount, and they seem to want 12 months of records for that. And being self-employed, I would often have money going into the company as a capital because the company needed it, and then coming out and so on. There was no regularity. And that made it very, very difficult. Thankfully, the bank we went with were happy to use my voluntary pension contributions as a sign of regular savings. But had it not been for that, it was something where we did have savings, but we just didn't make them regular enough. So it's kind of playing by their rules and just knowing that from day one. And that could be a 12-month process if they want to see 12 months worth of savings. So, starting on that today rather than waiting till you've got the deal is I think great. And I think that concept of going through for a dry run is quite a good one, because then you're kind of sitting down and you're coming up with a number of something you'd want to buy and just seeing what you actually need. And when they say no, at least you can ask them then, well, what do I need to do to get a yes? And then come back, and they will usually typically say, I suspect they'll probably say, come back in 6 months' time and try again. So
well, the other thing to remember is that if you're going to go out, if you want to be an active property investor or developer or whatever, the first deal you come across is not the one that you're going to secure, is not the one that's necessarily the best one. I would be looking at deals all the time. I mean, constantly. And you get to the point, you might look at 100 deals and you might end up doing 3 of them. Because you'll look at 100 deals, maybe only 20 of them are any good. But by looking at 100, you now understand that, okay, this represents value. And I know that because I've looked at these other 80 deals that didn't represent value. The more you look at, the more the good deals stand out. And you start to see patterns and you say, okay, yeah, I like how this deal is looking. It's far better than the previous few that we looked at. And then you've got to understand that you're not alone in the market. There will be other competitive bidders trying to get this property. And so that's the next hurdle you've got to cross. You found the property, you've sifted through all the ones that aren't particularly good. Now you've got to go and actually competitively bid against somebody else. And that's where your banking relationship is so important, because if that guy that you're bidding against has already done all of that work with the bank, he's going to have the loan straight away. Whereas you might have to go and make an offer subject to finance or something like that, which just adds that element of uncertainty. And the person you might even be offering more money, but if it's subject to finance, there's no certainty there. Whereas the guy that's offering a little bit less is able to give him the guarantee that, no, I've got the cash ready and the bank is here, with a letter saying that your loan is approved or whatever. That gives you that little bit of advantage.
I guess talk about that process a little bit, because, dealing with auctioneers and so on, it's quite a stressful thing. And, we managed to, in the deal that we managed to do, and I guess similar to yourself, Gavin, I mean, we looked at so many deals and, had so many kind of run-ins with auctioneers, and just found some of the auctioneers, frankly speaking, were, bordering on lying to us about some of the properties that we were looking at. how do you is there any advice that you would give when dealing with an auctioneer around kind of sussing them out? And I know some people will often say, that has some tips and tricks around putting an offer in. Is there anything that you would do as kind of a safety bet or any advice you'd have there?
There's a lot of different types of people out there, and it takes a while until you figure it out. And so reputation is everything. Your reputation and the reputation of the people that you're working with. So anytime you tell somebody you're going to do something, like by all accounts, go ahead and do exactly what you said so that you develop a relationship as a person of trust and integrity and somebody you can rely on. On the same side, you flip that around, you sort of say, that's exactly what you want from the people around you. Now, auctioneers, I've met certain auctioneers who would have preferred people that they want to get the deal into the hands of. It might be a friend or something like that. So you just have to be wary of that kind of stuff. And also, I mean, I'm not going to paint, there are obviously, there's bad people out there. There's bad solicitors and there's bad auctioneers that will basically tell you whatever you want to hear to go and get you to buy the thing, because he doesn't get paid unless the property actually secures, unless he secures a buyer. And so, there's a certain amount of motivation. So you need to make sure that the person you're dealing with is a person of integrity. And there's a lot of, I've got some fantastic relationships with guys going back, 10, 15, 20 years. And they're guys that I, trust absolutely for good advice. They wouldn't put me wrong because they know that I'll be back again. And when I come back again, I will, I'll basically give him another deal and I'll give him another transaction and we'll do something else together. So if he tells me this is not the one for you, Gavin, then I'll take his advice on that because I know that he has my best interests. Now, you don't always have that with a complete stranger for the first time. So it's important that you get to know. And like we said about having a dry run, if you're in a situation where you've done this a couple of times, if you're going out looking at 100 deals, you're obviously going to meet the same auctioneer several times, and you're going to end up in a situation where the guy is you'll see from the pattern of the deals that you're looking at that this particular guy is bringing me a lot of good quality stuff. This other individual is bringing me a lot of crappy stuff that he's been unable to sell to other people, and so he's kind of offloading it on me.
To be honest, that's wonderful advice. And I like what you mentioned there about the reputation, because I think sometimes we forget, and I think I've probably made this mistake, that exactly that you're going to bump into these auctioneers time and time again, and particularly if you're going back and forward and you're looking at 100 deals and so on. And so there's no point kind of burning the bridge on one deal and then having to, another listing comes up and you go, oh gosh, I wouldn't mind having a look at that. Oh gosh, look who the auctioneer is. Do I have to deal with that guy again? So,
you're only as good as your last deal and how you behaved in the last transaction. And if, a lot of people, I have an acquaintance who bought a property years ago, and then he decided to sell it, and he agreed to sell it to me, and then he changed his mind and sold it to somebody else because they were offering more. But there was all of this messing where he didn't want to tell me that he had got a better price, and he was making all these excuses, and it eventually comes out, and it does burn that bridge, and you suddenly realize, okay, that guy, can't really trust him too well. So you do have to tread carefully. Anytime there's money involved, you got to understand that money pressure makes people do things that is not necessarily, what they would like to do, but they're kind of forced to do it. And you just got to bear that in mind. And it's the same with getting into business with partners and stuff. I've had some fantastic partners that have really, stood to me, but then I've gone into difficult times, and suddenly the pressure of the difficult times brings out something that you never saw before in that partner. And you suddenly realize, whoa, I'm on my own here. This guy does not have my interests at heart now any longer. It was all great when the market was going great, but suddenly the guy is looking out for himself and nobody else. And you've just got to be. This is why I say treat this business like it's a business. It's easy to start letting kind of the extra money that you're making make you a little bit soft and start to look at stuff and, I'll do this and I'll do that. And you start to get a bit less disciplined, and that can cost you. So just treat it like a business, and I think you'll be well advised.
If you don't mind, let's just talk about tenants a little bit. And I'm assuming that you've got some property out there that is tenanted. And, given how busy I suspect you are, you're probably not wanting to take a call at 9 p.m. at night because the toilet's broken. So do you typically, some of your smaller deals, would you be looking to get a property manager in place? Or, what advice would you give to people who maybe are starting out, and, is it worth paying that 10% to get a property manager to look after a property, or is it something that you would advise people to kind of do themselves?
Well, I think at the outset, if you're starting off in your career and you're at day one, then I think probably the best thing to do is to do all of that. Now, obviously, this is probably directed more to an active investor. If you're a passive investor and you've got like a full-time job, I mean, I know plenty of guys that might be solicitors or accountants or whatever, and they want to make the investment, but they have their full day of work, and so they can't be going off, dealing with these kind of issues. So in that situation, it makes sense. Go and get a property manager. He'll deal with all the tenants and finding the tenant and dealing with all the headaches that tenants might have. But I think if you're sort of wanting to create a career for yourself in this business, I think it makes sense to start out by doing it all yourself, because then you understand all of the issues that arise, and you're better in a position then to know when a property manager comes along and says, I can do that for you, and it's going to cost you, say, 10% of your rent or whatever. You understand, well, I know what that time is costing me, and therefore I'm prepared to go and do that. I'm prepared to pay him that because my time is worth more than that 10% is worth. And so, you don't know that though until you've actually been through it. Now, in my case, what I did when I started out is I got one property going, did it all myself, got another property going, did it all myself, got a third and fourth. And then it was only when I got around to the fourth that I started feeling the pressure of all of these things. And what I actually did was I hired a personal assistant, and that personal assistant then suddenly started to take over some of that extra stress and extra strain. And that freed me up to go and look for more deals and to go out and add value to other properties. So, it gets to that point where whether this assistant is somebody that can kind of come in and work actually staffed for you, or maybe you just go to a property estate management company and you sort of say to them, look, I'd like to give you these 5 properties, give me a deal on, the management of all 5 of those and look after everything. And I only want to hear from, when there's a new tenant to be decided upon. Because tenants are, I've had a tenant in a property for 18 years and paid the rent absolutely religiously for 18 years. That's the perfect situation. He hardly ever called me. When he called me, it was because the dishwasher was broken and he wanted a new one. And I would organize that. I'd actually tell him, go and buy the new one, get it organized yourself, and you can just deduct it from the rent that you're paying me. And it was self-managed basically. And in the end, over 18 years, he paid me 2.5 times more than the value of that property in rent. So he had actually paid for my house 2.5 times. And that was just the perfect deal. Now, I've had other situations where tenants have stopped paying rent, and when you ring them up, they give you this sort of sob story. But the reality is that they were using the rent for other stuff. And I ended up going in to kind of have a talk with them and suddenly find that they've left the property and they left it in a terrible state. And, so you do have to vet your tenants very well. Don't overlook the fact that, go and check out if he has a previous history with other landlords, talk to that other landlord, try to find out. Also, just a little tip, bear in mind that the landlord that the previous person had might be only delighted that they got rid of them, and they might not want to say something that would actually cause them to kind of not get rid of them. So you do need to, ask the right question and say, would you be happy for this guy to rent from you again, and things like that, just to make sure that you're dealing with the right person. And also, COVID-19 has obviously added a whole layer of kind of concern, because you've got jobs now that people can lose, and you've got people being furloughed. And so you just have to be a little bit more careful. One of the reasons that I got into commercial property is because with commercial property, well, depending on the size of it and stuff, but usually it's 4 checks a year paid in advance. And that is the sum total of your involvement. And they're responsible for insuring and repairing the property, so you don't have any work to do on it. And so that is one of the reasons why commercial makes a lot of sense. Now, it has its drawbacks as well, but it can be far less hands-on in that kind of context.
So look, I've got one last question for you before we wrap up, and it's just on social housing and social housing initiatives and things like that. And I know that, for example, the Limerick City Council will often advertise a deal or where you can get, they will fill the tenant for you and manage the property for you. Have you got any thoughts? I've had both good and bad experiences from that, from listeners on the show sort of reach out to me. Is that ever something that you've actually explored yourself, or would you have any advice on it as to why you should or shouldn't do it?
Well, I have some friends doing it. I haven't done it myself personally, so I'm probably not the best person to ask, but two of my friends have done some great deals with the local authority, and they've basically agreed. They bought a property or a piece of land, and they did all of the stuff that they needed to do to get into a position where the local authority agreed to rent the property from them. And they would put they would basically put people from a housing list into the property. And you're not dealing with the tenant, you're dealing with the local authority a lot of the time. So they pay you this lump sum for all of the properties that you're renting to them. And so that's been very lucrative. Two of my friends did very well doing that. So, but personally, it's not something that I've gone down. Since I got into commercial property, I didn't really look at that. So I guess I'm not really the best person to ask.
No, thanks, Gavin. Look, I just wanted to pick your brain on it because I do get a few questions on it. So, thank you for sharing that. So, I mean, look, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, Gavin. You've really given some great advice. And look, let's take the time to talk a little bit about your own podcast that I know you've only just started recently. So, do you want to share a little bit about what the podcast is and how you can find it?
All right, guys, so that is it for episode 19 of Behind the Facade. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Thank you so much for listening. You will find a web link to the Irish Fire podcast if you're interested in listening to that. Michael's a great guy, so go and I do recommend you listen to a couple of his episodes and maybe you'll get hooked on that as well. If you found this episode useful at all, I'd be really grateful if you would share it with a friend, or even better, if you have a moment, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this. It really helps with the podcast's ranking and getting us noticed. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes, then I recommend you join the Facebook group Behind the Facade Community, where you'll get exclusive content and weekly videos and things like that. And for those of you who are listening who are already members, you'll be seeing a lot more of me in the coming weeks now that I am finished with this work from home kind of period. Lastly, if you want to connect with me or learn anything more about me, you should head over to my website. That is Gavin J Gallagher.com /go, and that'll bring you through to my newsletter sign up page. And also, if you want to check out my YouTube channel, the PropTech TV, where most of this content ends up. So until next time, guys, I hope you have a great week and speak to you all very soon.